Good morning, everybody. This is Carrie Getz, and welcome back to another edition of this podcast series, Careers for Women Trades and Vets in Tech and Data Centers. Today, we are lucky enough to have Casey Mason with Sabey Data Centers. Casey, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Casey Mason with Sabey Data Centers. As you said, I'm the Energy and Sustainability Manager for Sabey Data Centers.
How did you get into this role? What does that role entail? And tell us about your day a little bit.
Sure, yeah. So this role, it's the energy and sustainability. We've kind of learned are two they definitely work together, but they can also be two very different departments, one could say. But essentially, the role that I came into, it was a new role for Sabey Data Centers. There was nobody doing this job before I got into the company. The job description, they had an idea of what type of work, was going to be happening day by day, but there was no clear-cut idea of what exactly this role was going to do. So I got hired into that new role, which is really excited. And really the kind of broader thing that I've been working on is creating a sustainability program. Something that Sabey knew when they hired me was that we wanted to have goals to be net zero carbon by some timeline and figure out what that meant, figure out how we were going to get there. We knew that that was important for us to do, for all sorts of reasons, doing the right thing, competitive advantage, saving money, energy efficiency, all things that are just built into our core values. And so that's what I've been working on. And there's a lot of stuff that goes along with building a sustainability program, but really it's been trying to figure out the roadmap to net zero and developing a program and kind of communicating what that looks like to our company internally, and then communicating what that looks like to our current customers or potential customers.
Let's talk a little bit about how different it is for what you guys are doing internally versus what you're doing customer facing. We've talked to a couple other data center operators, and they've been very candid to say a big part of the reason they're doing the sustainability thing is because their tenants are really kind of demanding that path and demanding that look forward. And certainly not all customers are, but some are.
Mm-hmm.
Tell everybody a little bit about some of the steps that you're taking, how that interfaces with your customers, and then maybe go back to your point a little bit on the difference between energy efficiency and sustainability and talk about how that fits into those two equations.
Yeah, definitely. So we're a co-location data center, and I think maybe that's who you've talked to before, it sounds like, but essentially we're landlords for a lot of our customers. And so we basically rent a space for them. They put their equipment in that space, and we're in charge of making sure the cooling system, which is what most of the energy goes towards, that is not going towards the actual servers and equipment like that. We're making sure that the cooling systems are being really efficient, energy efficient. Any water use that's used in the data center, we want to make sure there's an efficient water use and we're conserving water wherever possible. And so that's kind of our job, is to make sure the core infrastructure for our customers is as energy efficient as possible. So when it comes to kind of the merging of energy efficiency, energy, and sustainability, so our goal is to be net zero by 2029 across our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. I know a lot of words there. You probably know what that means, it sounds like, though. But essentially our utilities that we work with, they're our utilities. We pay our energy bills to them, and they're in control of the fuel mix that our data centers are supplied with. And that fuel mix really has an impact on what net zero looks like to us. And so the conversations you have with your utilities in regulated markets or in deregulated markets, like in Texas, where we're building a data center right now, it looks really different because you might have the option to choose what your fuel mix looks like, or you might not at all have the option to choose what your fuel mix looks like. And then you have to go somewhere else and invest in renewable energy, be that through a virtual PPA or power purchase agreement, whether that be through procuring RECs. There's kind of this practice of how to green the energy that is sourced at your data center and what that looks like, and then the energy that is just the energy efficiency and kind of the engineering that goes into building management and building operations.
You bring up a really good point that I think some people might not be aware of, but you can't trace your electron. And you are very much, unless you build out that renewable field yourself, there's no way to guarantee that that is exactly the energy that you're consuming, which I think is kind of a bonus to some of the edge markets, because it's easier to build a small amount of renewables than it is a large amount of renewables, just because of land requirements and all that good stuff. And there's a lot of renewables out there that aren't even grid attached yet. So I think that makes that mix kind of tricky. And so I do see that part from the utility standpoint, but even from outside of what you do, it used to be in the co-location market, they didn't really worry about power because they just passed it on, right? It was just a cost that you passed through to customers. So it didn't matter how much power they used, how much they stranded, any of that kind of stuff. But certainly now with the sustainability goals, that changes. So how has your interactions with your customers changed, really trying to meet these sustainability goals? Do you have customers that are pushing back saying, we don't really care as much about that? We don't want any extra expense associated with that, or we're all in, we'll pay all the extra expenses. How does that work with your customer interaction?
Definitely, it seems like it's changed. I mean, the reason why I even have a role at this company is because there was demand for it, because our customers were asking us questions, and a lot of people who had all other responsibilities were trying to answer those questions, and it took a lot of time to get this information and then to communicate that with customers. So our customers are definitely becoming more and more sophisticated, as are we. And I think the supply, so us as the data center, provider, service provider, and then our customers, there seems to be this constant back and forth and kind of pressure on each other to reach some goal. And it seems like right now that's carbon neutrality, net zero, whatever you want to call it, 100% renewable energy, 24/7 carbon-free energy. Different companies, different customers have different goals. And so we try and set ourselves up so that we can help our customers reach their goals. And sometimes that does come with a high premium cost for maybe they want to buy RECs from a certain region, and that's a really expensive thing to do. Or maybe they really want to work with the utility and get some green tariff program. Which is a higher rate to actually get that renewable energy coming to your facility. Maybe they're like, hey, why don't you guys do, on-site solar or some type of distributed generation on your property so that you can actually follow the electron, like you were saying. And that's something, so we're constantly having those conversations with not only renewable energy developers, but also with our customers to see what are they expecting of us and what are we telling them that we're doing so that they can report on it themselves. I would say, I think an important thing is that the pending or proposed regulation by the SEC for climate disclosure has definitely, we're a private company, we're a kind of smaller company, operate pretty leanly. I've heard people say, but the Security and Exchange Commission regulation has placed more pressure on publicly traded companies who are going to be required to report climate emissions data, greenhouse gas emissions data. They're going to be required to report that to their investors. And so because we have customers that are going to be required to, that then forces us to make sure we can give them the data that they need from their security or from their service providers. So it's kind of another pressure system where we're required to do this reporting, and we're getting that pressure from our customers to do so.
And I think there's certainly some pushback on some of the reporting. I have heard from some folks, anytime you add government to the mix, the reporting gets very thick and very deep. And I do know that there are some countries that tried to do carbon taxation early on that had to give up on it because it's voluntary reporting. It's too hard to track. What are you seeing on that front as far as ways to track that energy? Are you seeing things coming out from the utility company? Are you seeing anything to make that any easier, or is it getting to be more and more complex?
Yeah, it's definitely, so I would say, kind of starting back to the beginning of your question, the basis that we do our greenhouse gas accounting, kind of the Bible, I would say, is the greenhouse gas protocol. And there are some there are some appendixes or additions that have been made to expand on the original greenhouse gas protocol, but it is still pretty ambiguous. And so some organizations like the Future of Internet Power have released white papers and guidance for data centers specifically to help them understand how they should account for their greenhouse gas emissions, how they can communicate it and ask the right questions. And so the requirement for companies to have to report on their emissions without there really being set guidelines is very problematic, definitely. And so we're, as an organization and as a industry, data center industry, doing our best to create that set of guidelines, to work with each other to figure out what we should be following and how we need to communicate this with each other, so that when we do have to do that reporting, we have some trail, we have some auditable trail, we have something that we've developed that's verifiable. We're comparing apples to apples across different data centers and different industries. Yeah. And
that is tricky too, as far as the apples to apples. I know something as simple as PUE,
yeah,
which everybody used to report, got so convoluted throughout marketing departments using and abusing the numbers, and people trying to put things in the number that didn't exactly exist in the number, and all kinds of things, from negative PUEs, which is impossible, to zero PUEs, which is also impossible,
right.
to, all kinds of equations. So I think that's going to be really tricky for people on the end user side to figure out what's baked into those numbers and what the reporting structure for those numbers are, to be able to do any kind of a real comparison between the two.
Yeah, I mean, PUE, I didn't even really think about PUE being involved in greenhouse gas accounting, which it certainly can be. That's not how we do our greenhouse gas accounting, because you can meter or sub-meter like the electricity.
And it wouldn't necessarily, I'm just saying as an example, PUE
totally.
got so convoluted that I think some of these sustainability numbers, if you try to compare one vendor to another, it might be very, very different, because you don't know what's gone into those particular equations, right?
Yeah.
So one company might have certain emissions that are scope 1 generated by themselves, whereas for another company that might be scope 3, because they pull that information in and they use another party for that. And I think that's where it starts getting really tricky and convoluted, is when you're trying to manage your own emissions and your vendor emissions. At some point, there's some double numbering here.
Yes.
There's some double accounting, and trying to compare apples to apples, I think, is going to be, really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing is, I've definitely seen, so I've been with Sabey for almost 2 years now, and I've definitely seen in that time period a lot more companies with software or with some portal that you can buy that will help you account for your greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of the people that I have talked to in search for a product to make it a lot easier, instead of it just being siloed on spreadsheets, which I know is a really big issue for a lot of sustainability folks, having it centralized place where there is a very, auditable trail of information. They get direct information from utilities. So it really helps you account for literally what your greenhouse gas emissions are. They don't have much for data centers. And so when you explain to them even a PUE, what is a PUE, or you explain to them IT equipment versus infrastructure equipment, it draws a lot of question marks. There are some companies for sure that I've talked to who are data center specific, but that's all they do. They just focus on the data center commercial space. That's it. And that's really helpful for us, because great, there's a niche now for what we're looking for. There's somebody who can actually help us with our greenhouse gas reporting. So it is really interesting. I've seen a lot of companies pop up that are trying to help with this and trying to help standardize it. And I think as things move along, as technology advances, as regulations get updated with more information, as guidelines and guidance becomes more firm, it'll be a lot easier to kind of traverse that space of software and portals. But right now it does kind of seem a little bit like the Wild West.
Yeah. And I've even heard some talk of some companies delisting because they don't want to have to deal with the ESG requirements that are coming from some of the publicly traded company requirements, because it is a lot of cost. I mean, look at Sabey, right? They've added your salary. They've added, obviously everybody that you interface with, that's a time constraint that's been added to the company. So some of these, well, I think it's a good thing. I'm certainly not saying that we should not do it, but the cost for implementing a lot of these programs can be pretty significant, especially for companies that have done nothing so far. And I would say for even other companies that don't have metering in the right place, like it's whole business metering, whole building metering, as opposed to pulling out the data center or pulling out pieces of that, it's going to be, I think there's going to be a lot of heads getting pounded against a lot of walls.
Yeah. And I mean, something I like to say is, like, there's a lot of obstacles and challenges and problem solving that we have to face and we're going to have to face. But I really do believe truly that we are stumbling in the right direction. Though we may be stumbling, I do think we are, like you said, we're stumbling in the right direction. We are doing it for the right reason. it just seems right now, it can just be a little chaotic on what you think is right and what guidance to follow. And that's where it becomes difficult. One thing that I really appreciate though is with other data center companies, whether they're hyperscale, whether they're colo, whatever form of data center provider they are, I have found, at least in the sustainability space, even if there are competitors, we are so willing to collaborate and problem solve and face these challenges together. And that is amazing to me. And that's not something that I think a lot of other people at Sabey experience. I mean, I can't say for sure, but I know that when I'm in a call with all these other data centers and folks on their sustainability team, and we're like, yeah, this is something that we have no idea what to do with. That's not something you would ever really market, right? You're not going to like put that in your blogs. We're not going to, you're not trying to say, hey, we have question marks here to our customers. And so to be able to talk through that stuff with other sustainability folks, it feels really, really good. For so many different reasons, but it is really nice, the collaboration that I get to experience in this space. And I think that collaboration is almost a product of the lack of guidance. We have to collaborate. We have no other choice. And so, good, bad, whatever, it is really, really nice that we get to have that experience and see these other perspectives and see how other companies are doing their reporting, or how they're thinking about their problem solving, how they're thinking about talking to their customers, or procuring renewable energy, or just procuring energy in general, developing their data centers. There's so many cool things we can learn from each other. And I feel really grateful I get to experience that kind of attitude in meetings with people.
And I will say this industry is like that in a whole. I mean, I tell everybody, anybody my age has been through one of the largest apprenticeship programs on the planet, because this industry has evolved, right? There's very few schools that teach this in college. Even for electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, those guys, they get some exposure to a data center, usually through an elective, but not as a target goal at the end, because the curriculum's just not there. Mm-hmm. And so this industry does really do a really, really good job of helping each other. It doesn't matter if they're your competitor or not. There's plenty of work to go around. There's plenty of data that needs to be stored. It's not like somebody's going to go belly up for answering a question to their competitor. And you never know, the person you compete with tomorrow could be your best ally the day after. So there is that spirit of cooperation in this industry, which I think is super, super helpful.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the parameters. Like, this is a growing and developing field. Have you gotten to the point where you've hit a couple numbers that all of a sudden made you need to go back and change a whole bunch of other stuff? And how impactful is that, just that constant cycle of reinvention and figuring things out?
Yeah. When I first started, we thought, so specifically for greenhouse gas accounting, we were going to account for our scope 1, our scope 2, and scope 3 emissions one way. And then about a month later, we found some guidance. It had been there for years. We just didn't know it existed. And we found some guidance from the Future of Internet Power that was like, actually, these are the best practices. And we were like, aha, this makes way more sense than the really straightforward stuff that we were doing. And so we changed everything. Luckily, we do so much sub-metering and metering and tracking that information, not just for our own selves, but also for our customers and the bills that we do. So it's not extremely difficult for us. It wasn't extremely difficult for us to change the way that we accounted, because we just basically changed the numerator, denominator, whatever, put those numbers, that data set, in a different bucket. But definitely it was a moment where it was like, wow, we just spent X amount of time doing it this way. And then we read a paper and it said, actually, this is best practices, and we changed everything. And ever since, we're doing it that way. I don't foresee that it will change, but I'm not holding my breath on anything, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an evolving field. So I think people are just going to get smarter and better. If you look at just how this industry has handled power consumption, we still have a long ways to go. Stranded power is still an issue. And, I think the purpose of the power that's drawn is going to end up being more of this consideration. Like, how companies sit around today and they say, okay, well, we're willing to absorb this amount of risk because the cost is X, or we're willing to. And I think we're going to start seeing that, especially with stranded power and some of these. If you're going to have to pay for something to sit around on the off chance that something might go down. Maybe the equation is, well, now we look and we only put the 8 applications that really, really need that level of redundancy there. And then some of the other ones we back off and we just have those as single power, or we take advantage of resiliency instead of redundancy, or do some different things there. Are you seeing any of that from customers requesting like their space looks a little bit different now, or what they install in that space looks a little different? Or do you think those are still just very much in the early evolving stages?
I haven't heard anything. I don't know that that information would come directly to me though. I remember somebody went to some conference. I think it was one of the sales folks on our team went to a conference, and somebody from iMasons was there, and they were talking about this stranded capacity and the need for it to not be stranded essentially. And like, how do we deal with that? Do we overlease, which, I don't think that we would ever do that. There would be so many issues potentially with that, but maybe, who knows? So it is a really interesting thing, especially in Ashburn here. What I've heard is that there's just not really much energy. There's so many data centers here, and there's so much energy going towards those data centers that there's an issue with capacity right now. And because of that, there is all this also stranded power in these data centers. So it's like, hey, we have the power, you guys have it, you're just not using it, but what do you do? So that it is a really interesting topic, and I will be interested to see how it evolves.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, this industry has done kind of nothing about making more educated consumers. So the people with the cell phones in their hands that are sending around the picture, I don't think people, that'd be interesting for some of these social media sites to start listing the carbon footprint. If you forward this to one person, this is what it's going to cost. If you forward it to 10, because, we just keep building capacity because the consumption never goes down. But at some point, I think we have to start working and teaching consumers how to be a little better stewards of their digital demands.
Sure. And I think that starts with teaching ourselves that information, because it's not something that, like you said, it's not something we're learning in school. Me in the data center industry, I wasn't thinking directly about how sending this email with all these spreadsheets on it is impacting, like what carbon footprint that has, this email that I'm sending, or what carbon footprint it has that we're, having a meeting all on Teams instead of in a conference room. There's so many different ways you could look at it. And actually last year on Earth Day, we did like a trivia or an information blast internally that was like, hey, by the way, this email probably has about this carbon footprint associated with it. And maybe in the future, try to reduce the amount of emails you send. This will not only make people more happy, but
there's a whole big part of their day.
Exactly. So it is, I think it really does start with educating ourselves, because then we can, and then make sure that information is accurate before we start telling other people. But definitely, for sure. I know when Google released I buy my flights on Google Flights, and when Google released it, it says like the carbon footprint of your flight on all the different airlines you could go to. And that was really fascinating to me. And it was like, well, maybe I do actually change my selection because the carbon footprint is different. Maybe it's $10 more, but it's somehow half the carbon footprint. Well, that's a choice that I can now make because you provided me that information.
Sure. It's like size of airplane, number of seats, all of those go into how much each individual ticket has.
Yep.
I think is why the guys that fly the private jets around get so much flack when they fly around and talk to people about climate change in their private planes. Deservedly so. But anyway, so as far as the future, like the next 12 months, what's on your radar there at Sabey, as far as sustainability goes? What are you guys working? What's your next big project?
Yeah, there's so many big projects. So I guess something that I've just been looking into a lot recently is the new Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA that was recently passed, has all these cool new credits potentially for renewable energy developers, which would impact the data center industry and anybody who is trying to purchase renewable energy or is trying to reduce their carbon footprint. And there's a bunch of cool stuff. It seems like it's not fully parsed out how everything in that regulation is going to be, but there's a lot of cool stuff that could really impact our buying decision and our buying power, specifically as it comes to procuring renewable energy. So that's a really big thing, just kind of watching that and then talking to the renewable energy developers over the next few years. We've had a lot of conversations and, done some consulting engagements, in fact, over the last 2 years for PPAs, for all these different really cool things we could do. And it was all just very, very economically difficult to do them. And now all of a sudden there's this new regulation that might make it a lot more economic for us and it might pencil. And so that's going to be a really big thing to watch. And that would potentially change our approach to how we reach net zero. So that's really exciting. Really excited to kind of watch that.
Yeah, I think that infrastructure bill, there's obviously a lot of money in there. They're a long way from figuring out which agencies are going to get that money and how that's going to be divvied out. I mean, that bill passed some time ago, and it's all right now, the call for interest, at least for most of the big ones that I can see. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that will start metering out in some meaningful way, in some way that can actually work with supply chains so that it's effective before it expires.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there were some tax credits, the production tax credit. Yeah, there were some tax credits that existed before that were helping renewable energy expand on our grid. And that's probably why we have the type of renewable energy, the amount of renewable energy that we currently have. And it tapered off. And so it kind of is resetting now, but in a slightly different way, it seems like. Another thing, just one more thing to mention that I think is important is Scope 3 emissions and just the downstream and upstream supply chain that are very, very hard to calculate and understand and get a grip on, as well as the embodied carbon in the data centers that we build, all the concrete that we have in these data centers, the steel, all of the stuff that goes into building a data center. We're trying to understand how to reduce the carbon footprint when we build our data centers and what materials we should use instead of the ones we have been using in the past. So that's a really big thing. And then also just that open communication with our customers, because we are each other's supply chain, right? So having that collaborative attitude with our customers, maybe it involves having language in our leases that dictates what we need to be talking about and what cadence we should be talking about renewable energy, or we should be talking about energy efficiency, or incentives to have energy efficient servers in the data centers, or incentives for us to reduce water consumption. There's so much we could do to work with our customers to reduce the power usage, and also just to work together and collaborate and figure out how to help each other get to our goals.
Yeah, and I think that'll be fun for customers. It's something new to look at, but certainly something you have to plan for. You're not going to just hand this over to an AA and they're going to spend 5 minutes and you're going to be sorted out for sure.
Sure. Yes, exactly. Like the things we've been working on for the last, since I've been working on for the last 2 years, things just change so quickly depending on how the energy market is that day, depending on, what bill was just passed. There's so many impacts. There's so many external things that impact our internal decision making. And it's super important for us to just keep an eye on that. And yeah.
Well, I think anytime you watch something and you pay attention to it because it's an important goal for the company, then it really, you can't do anything but improve, right? Because you're watching it. And the fact that you are watching it leads to that improvement. So I think it's a good thing that you guys are doing what you're doing. So we're almost up to time here. If you wanted to leave some folks with some great words of wisdom, maybe thinking about a career in sustainability or doing what you do, what would you recommend for people coming behind you?
My advice, my words of wisdom are to really speak up, ask questions, don't shrink. And if you do get shut down or if you do get rejected, don't let that stop you from standing up, speaking up, asking questions in the future. Something that I read a few years ago was about this concept of a failure resume, where you essentially list all the things you've ever failed at, all the things you've got rejected from. And those things are, those failures, those rejections are notches in your belt that show that you're pursuing something that's challenging, that's worthwhile. And so it's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a really good thing to show that you have failed, to show that your journey is not a journey of perfection. It's a journey of trial and error. It's a journey where you've faced obstacles. And hopefully in the future, you can overcome those obstacles. So I think that's the biggest word of advice is don't let your failures stop you from making success happen for yourself and for the people around you in the future. Failure is an important part in the journey, and it will take you a lot of great places. And I'm really happy for all my failures, and I really think that they helped me get to where I am now.